over in Doha now, and we're joined live by CNN senior international correspondent Sam Kiley. Sam, thanks for your time this evening, your time. So after 20 years, the war is over, apparently, in Afghanistan. How momentous is this?
Well, it's an absolutely staggering moment of history. I was at the fall of the Taliban, the battle for Tora Bora, when Al-Qaeda was allegedly crushed, bringing to an end the threat that had posed, that organisation had posed to the United States and other nations, everybody thought. Then for the next 20 years, we were in and out of Afghanistan. Australian troops fought very hard there for many, many years. Nations from around the world fighting against the Taliban and other groups, but predominantly the Taliban for 20 years. And there they are, waving off and shooting into the sky, celebrating the demise of the international coalition, the withdrawal, of final US withdrawal, and the amazing evacuation of 123,000 people by a US-led coalition in under 14 days. So a remarkable series of events which, for so many people around the world, has actually marked much of their adult life, Peter.
Yeah, and Sam, you know the region better than anyone, I'd say. What sort of a mess now has been left behind? I mean, I mentioned at the beginning the war is apparently over, but not really for Afghans, is it?
No, not for the Taliban. They were ready, as we know, following these attacks by ISIS-K, so-called. Of course, these aren't the first attacks that they've conducted or attempted attacks against the airfield. The US knocking out a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device or suicide bombers inside a vehicle. A day before yesterday, 10 civilians killed in that strike, 6 of them children. So civilians dying right up to the end of this phase in the war. But now the Taliban have got an insurgency on their hands in terms of coping with ISIS-K, which will certainly continue its pressure and its attempts to embarrass and undermine the Taliban, or indeed try to take over the Taliban. That's what they did to elements. Most of Al-Qaeda was taken over by ISIS in northern Syria, and then they took over a large amount of land. So this will be seen as an opportunity by them. The Taliban are also facing a continued resistance, not yet particularly violent, the Panjshir Valley, where large numbers of government troops have fled. And then they got the warlord issue right across the country. The warlords have folded themselves into the Taliban, but they'll be wanting to see rewards for so doing, or they will be fractious too. So this is by no means the end of conflict inside Taliban, but it is the end, at least, of operations over 20 years by an international coalition led by the US, Peter.
So is it civil war now, Sam? Are there shades of Iraq and Syria here when a power vacuum has been left behind?
It's not a power vacuum. It's a very fragile system that the Taliban have got to knit together. They are going to have to make good on their moderate pledges that they've been making to respect human rights, allow women to get educated, to allow people who are carrying international passports or the visas to leave the country to continue to do so, to reopen the airports, to try to form an inclusive government if they're going to get trade and aid. If they don't get trade and aid, they're going to have a conflict on their hands almost inevitably. They may get that anyway. They are in the middle of negotiating with the Northern Alliance, as we would all remember them to be, the Tajik forces of the Panjshir Valley, to avoid a conflict there. They do appear, at least at the central level, at the leadership level, wanting to not see a power vacuum, occasionally even being quite honest about the fact that some of their fighters are pretty rough diamonds, to say the least. They're very undisciplined in terms of their relationship with women and so on, and apologising and saying, well, we need to get a grip on them in order to keep things under control. So it's a very fragile situation that could tip very rapidly into a civil war. It will be a matter of weeks, I think, before we know exactly what direction that's taking. But it is fragile, extremely fragile.
Do you believe that the Taliban has changed? Can they be trusted this time around, Sam?
They've had 20 years. Their leadership has had 20 years, in a sense, engaging in some respect with modern technology, with smartphones, which didn't exist back in 2001. They've been part of international diplomacy for several years here in Qatar. They have one of their top leaders, Mullah Baradar, has met frequently with the American negotiators. They are part of that structure. The issue for them will be their rank and file supporters who've been effectively brainwashed, fed a very kind of medieval view, a very crude view of Islam, and that is the only kind of education that they've had, largely illiterate fighters that they have who are pumped full of a very uncompromising version of Islam, and a very primitive one at that. Whether they can actually take those fighters with them as they try to engage in a more nuanced role, or whether they simply fold themselves back into that very medieval idea of how they're going to govern the country, and then we'll see a repeat of what we saw between 96 and 2001, where women were banned from schools and homosexuals were stoned to death. Peter?
Now that the last American flight has left, Sam, we can talk about legacy. I mean, people have been talking about that for a while now anyway, but what do you believe is the legacy of the Afghan war?
Broken hearts in Afghanistan, 20 years of faith put by an urban population. And remember that the population of Kabul at the time the Taliban were deposed was maybe 500,000. It's now about 4 million. These are predominantly people who had faith in an emerging modern state, or the emergence towards a modern state. It was by no means a democracy, but belief in the sorts of attitudes and cultural norms that the West so cherishes, that the West so frequently goes to war to protect it. At least it claims that's why it goes to war. And now they've been abandoned. So 123,000 people, most of them Afghans, have fled the country because they fear a return to medievalism. So that is heartbreak for them. I think that the legacy of the Afghan war will be picked over by historians for years to come. In the immediate geostrategic sense, this gives Pakistan a very powerful level of leverage with Kabul. It's probably the most influential country over the Taliban. That will rattle the Indians somewhat. Both of them nuclear powers, those two countries, both of them daggers drawn most of the time. So that is a significant shift there. And we'll have to see what happens geostrategically. But in terms of the personal legacy, whether you're Australian, British, American, or any member of these coalition, all of these countries have bled into the soil of Afghanistan and wasted a gigantic amount of money only to see the Taliban back in power.
And just finally, what's Joe Biden's role in all of this?
Well, he inherited the plans to withdraw rapidly from Afghanistan from his predecessor, Donald Trump. He's come under a great deal of criticism, particularly, obviously, from the Republican Party. And this one is something that is really sticking to him. This is his foreign policy agony, if you like. He had always maintained that the mission in Afghanistan to get rid of al-Qaeda had been accomplished, and that the nation-building mission was a waste of blood and money. And so he was always anxious to get out. It has been criticised for the rapidity with which he got out. He's counter-argued and said, well, we could have put more men and women and risked more lives and stayed almost indefinitely. But the Republicans are making hay over this, not least because they point to places like North Korea, where the United States has spent much more money for many more years trying to maintain peace there between North and South Korea.
Yep, it'd be very interesting to see what happens following the midterms and those calls for impeachment grow louder. Sam Kiley, really good to get your insights this morning. Appreciate your time live from Doha following that huge news this morning that the last American flight has left Kabul.